Hello, good morning or good afternoon, depending where you are in the world. My name is James Lamond. I am the director of the Democratic Resilience Program here at the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, in Washington, D.C. On behalf of CEPA and the Institute of Modern Russia, I am thrilled to welcome you here for today's event, Operation COVID, How COVID-19 Became a Tool of Information Warfare. The COVID-19 pandemic has not only been a public health crisis and an economic crisis, but as with previous pandemics, as soon as the virus started to spread internationally, it quickly became a tool of geopolitical competition. From shipments of PPE and mass diplomacy in the early days to the spread of propaganda and dangerous conspiracy theories, and increasingly vaccines as a tool of public diplomacy and even information warfare, the public health crisis has been playing out on the international relations stage. Two important reports have recently come out that help us bring a significant amount of data and research to help us understand this dynamic. The first is the rise and fall of Sputnik, how the Kremlin and the coronavirus vaccine are used as a tool of information warfare by the Institute of Modern Russia. And CEPA recently published Jabbed in the Back, mapping Russian and Chinese information operations during COVID-19. Here to discuss these findings and the broader information environment around COVID-19, we have an extraordinary panel of experts. Dalia Bankunetskia, a senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. We have Ben Dubo, who's a fellow with the center. Vera Michelin-Chapier, a visiting research fellow at King's Center for Strategic Communications at King's College London. And Olga Kosanova, the director of the Institute of Modern Russia. To start us off, I'd like to ask each panelist an opening question and do a round with everyone. It simply is, how has COVID-19 shape the international use of information warfare between states? So first, I'd like to turn to Dalia.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, James. It's a pleasure to be there this evening. In my case, if to assess the information environment on the eastern flank of the European Union and NATO, we have just to look at an ordinary day on my part of the world, September 10th or today's. And here in the information environment, you will see the highway of flow of information as well as disinformation mixed with misinformation. Topics: COVID as pandemia with number of regulations, procedures, then vaccination and anti-vaccine information flows, as well as disinformation, combined with the irregular migration crisis on the eastern flank, Belarus, Lithuania, Poland, then the information coming from the irregular migrants that are staying in migrants camps or places. Then we have energy crisis or prices raising up. So that's also the topic that is highly circulated. And in addition to the regular stuff of any disinformation that is practiced every day, as well as the espionage or intelligence in intelligence services of third parties like China, Russia, or Belarus quite active on the eastern border. So having that all that picture, the question comes to what to do, because exposure is absolutely clear. The quick and shortest response could be have a strong identification mechanism, and then identify and prevent, and have a prevention mechanism. But on the other hand, it's no surprising that in this situation, the societal resilience is extremely topical, not only the issue, but as a phenomena, as a task for each nation country on my part of the world. So here, no surprise, Baltic states, Lithuania, Baltic states do monitor the societal resilience to disinformation on annual basis. And no surprise that this year, the score of resilience given by experts is lower than in comparison to 2020. noticing that the flow of information or disinformation has increased significantly by 2 or 3 times. Daily we receive at least 11 malign information, unique cases of disinformation in our information space. We can observe the vulnerable groups much more exposed to the third party activities in our information space. There's polarization and fragmentation, as well as social groups become much more vulnerable. So all these facts are influencing the societal resilience. The positive side, and this is my last sentence, the positive side is that the mechanism of building up the resilience, strengthening resilience, societal resilience, is assessed as getting improved and getting stronger.
Thank you for that. Always nice to end on a positive note, but I think, identify, prevent, and build societal resilience. Fantastic. Ben, I'd like to turn to you next.
Thanks, James. So the COVID-19 pandemic brought about radical changes to the information environment, and especially in the early months, these seemed to overwhelmingly favor authoritarian states. Above all was the retreat of general information from the actual physical world to a world filtered through social media, as people became more and more reliant on social media for their news, as they couldn't go outside, engage in the normal physical social networks through which they normally got information, which was especially true for journalists. In addition, propaganda is most successful when it reflects its target audience's current understanding of the world. And in the early months, as it seemed that China was really doing a phenomenal job of keeping COVID under wraps, as well as Russia, although both of these were in no small part thanks to underreporting, while the US, especially in the West at large, really struggled with the virus. There really was kind of the perfect fertile soil to spread information campaigns that projected democracy as fundamentally flawed and fundamentally unsuited for the current political environment. As the year progressed, though, a lot of these information campaigns proved to be largely ineffective. China's information operations apparatus has never had significant success in terms of driving engagement, which is something that we reported on in our SIPA study. But it really struggled as it became clear that China was hiding a significant amount about the origins of COVID, that China really had not acted responsibly in the beginning of COVID, and their vaccine diplomacy, especially with their vaccines generally considered less reliable than Western vaccines, really struggled to improve China's standing overall. And opinion polls generally show across the board a significant reduction in trust across countries in China, despite the first months of the pandemic really seeming to set the stage for China to overtake the United States. On the Russian angle, with more of a goal towards just sowing chaos as opposed to any sort of constructive goals, the information environment generally devolved into chaos, especially in the United States, but more broadly as well. So Russia, while somewhat successful in achieving these goals, for the most part, they were just kind of a drop in the ocean of a lot of domestic voices in these countries that were promoting chaos or just reflecting on what was indisputably a poor initial reaction, as well as slow vaccination times that continue. So what we saw was that the two real powerhouses in terms of international propaganda with COVID, on the Chinese side, you had pretty significant effort that wound up not yielding the results. It is still possible that people would think even less of China if not for this information operations campaign, but China's standing has definitely been lessened over the past year and a half in the eyes of populations across the world. Russia was part of much larger trends that were sowing chaos and sowing larger distrust, although to what extent we can actually credit Russia for that, as opposed to Russia just being part of a much larger trend, is questionable.
Excellent, thank you. I like the line, a drop in the bucket of domestic disinfo. And so I want to come back to that later in the conversation, absolutely, and get everyone's thoughts on that point. But Vera, if we could turn to you next.
Yes, thank you. I think that my thoughts on this are very connected to both Dalia and Ben's kind of introductory remarks. I think that happened during this pandemic and what happened with what we looked at particularly, which is the vaccine effort, was that really it brought everything, all this kind of social trends, all the things that we've seen before, it brought everything it kind of underlined everything and made everything much starker. So, I mean, when we look at, and this is just a word on terminology in our report, when we discuss information war, we relate specifically to the Russian term of informaционная война, which is a very important kind of term in Russian political discourse. I mean, you cannot overestimate how much this term informaционная война and informaционное противоборство, which is kind of warfare, is being used in Russia. And in Russia, this term particularly is sort of nested within their political discourse as a kind of a state-backed informational psychological effort that includes, and here I'm kind of quoting, propaganda, agitation, disinformation, demonstrative and demonstrational actions. Yes, so it's a kind of a broad umbrella of efforts that aim to influence the emotional and psychological state of target audiences. And it is done, I mean, Russia constantly complains that it's done against Russia, yes, by the West, that the West engages in informaционная война. And obviously, when we look at how Russian state actors operate, we see very obviously that they engage in that. Yes, this is part of their efforts. And then we also see that they do it domestically. I mean, this is not only something that they do on the international arena, and the domestic side, which we also highlight in our report, is also part of this story, because you can't really and disentangle these efforts. And when Olga and I when we started writing our report, when we started thinking about it and about this complex tool, yes, and how it evolves, we were not thinking about writing about Sputnik V or COVID. We just, as we discussed Sputnik V, as we discussed the rollout of Sputnik V and what happens with what we call the information environment, and in relation to Sputnik V, informaционная война became the most sort of relevant framework, yes, because it brings to light everything that we've been discussing. And the most important point that we were discussing in our previous, in our conversations about what is informaционная война, is the complexity of this tool. It's the fact that you can't measure its impact. It's the fact that it's not a straightforward tool that you sort of press a button and, a missile goes out and or you can somehow predict the impact of that. And in the research that we've done, I mean, in what we looked at, which is the Russian vaccine, just kind of to place everyone, Sputnik V was registered in Russia. It was developed by the Russian Gamaleya Institute for Epidemiology and Microbiology, and promoted by the Russian Direct Investment Fund. So when you look at how the Russians handled that, and in our report really very, very vividly shows how they use this framework of informaционная война in relation to Sputnik V, you see the discrepancy of this weapon. You see how, on the one hand, you have we from researches we've done, you have a working vaccine that is probably kind of induces your immunity to COVID, but on the other hand, this kind of approach, this complex approach that is so unpredictable, what it meant domestically in Russia was that the ordinary Russians lost trust in their government, and they didn't vaccinate at good rates from the beginning, and they're lagging behind now. And with the new variants, this just becomes a very sort of tragic picture. So I think that what we see during COVID is all these gaps within societies and within these very complex tools. They're just coming to fore and become ever starker.
Yes, it's one of the more astonishing things that despite this robust investment in and propaganda around the vaccines, the hesitancy rate and the vaccination rates well, the hesitancy rates are incredibly high and the vaccination rates are incredibly low, even within Russia. So it says something about the trust. But now just to turn to Olga to finish out the first round of the opening remarks. Olga.
Thank you, James. Thank you for having us and for giving us the opportunity to talk about this very topical issue. I just want to pick up where Vera left off and continue with the idea that the COVID pandemic and what we see with the information space, basically our research for this report on Sputnik V showed that there is a reach to information warfare and there are limits. And one of the reasons for that is that the current public space, the information environment, has become increasingly complex. It has been becoming, and increasingly more so, a shared space. It's a global space. So everyone's problems become exposed in this space. So what happens in Russia echoes elsewhere in the world, even if Russia is not engaged in information efforts or propaganda. So basically, because of this shared space, and especially when the shared space is in turbulence, when the pandemic struck, we see all the problems surface and we see them exacerbate. And we see that in this sort of overexposed state, we can identify vulnerabilities of the democratic system that we were not probably aware of before. And we can also see how the authoritarian regimes are constantly identifying these vulnerabilities and learning how to exploit them. And the reason we actually started looking at the Sputnik V promotion was to understand the Putin regime better, because it's such a closed system. And when you study that regime operations within the information space, you can sort of backtrack and get to what this regime wants. What are these efforts about? And so we identified the key narratives that were put out there. And this narrative tell us a lot about the regime. One of them is that, like Vera said, the West is apparently engaged in an information war against Russia, which makes Russia feel like a victim of this information war and gives it an excuse to defend itself. So that's the premise, and this is the modus operandi of the Putin regime. So for the Putin regime, it's important to be defensive and also a victim of this onslaught that it's experiencing for many years, according to history. However, what we also saw as part of this entire effort to promote Sputnik V, also, like Vera mentioned, Sputnik V has been used not primarily as a vaccine or as a medicine to treat virus, to make the country overcome the pandemic, but essentially as an information weapon. And it is not straightforward, and we saw how it has backfired. For example, as part of its domestic propaganda, the Russian Channel 2 and one of its key anchors, Dmitry Kiselyov, has spent a lot of time trying to disparage the Western vaccines, inflate the side effects, invent those side effects. So a lot of focus was placed on sort of trying to discredit the Western vaccines and show how the West is in chaos and struggles to fight the pandemic. So basically to contrast the Russian government's good efforts with the Western government's bad efforts. But when you have this powerful, and his program is the top program in Russia, when you have this powerful information tool, and you talk about the vaccine in negative terms, even if you try to talk about the Western vaccine, at the same time, the side effects is that what people hear, vaccine bad, vaccine side effects. So their anxiety is growing in relation to their own Sputnik V vaccine. And the second part of the second example that I want to give is related to the original scene of the Sputnik V, which was registered prematurely early during, I think the second stage was still going on. And while Russia has this Sputnik moment where it won the vaccine race and apparently has a lot of reasons to be happy about it. At the same time, the suspicion and the mistrust that originated from that earlier registration has taken very deep roots, and it has become the reason why domestic vaccination efforts failed in Russia. One of the reasons why international marketing promotion also stumbled, and the reason why everyone is still holding this mistrust, I guess, for Sputnik V, despite the Lancet review, despite other research data that showed that Sputnik V, it's a good vaccine. It's on par with the key Western vaccines. So that's sort of highlighting both the regime's intentions, its modus operandi, vulnerabilities of this tool, and vulnerabilities of democratic countries as well.
Thank you for that so much. So I want to turn to Dalia next. I want to bring up the point that Ben had actually mentioned earlier, where where he said there's it was a drop in the bucket between the sort of international disinformation and the domestic disinformation. And so, we've obviously seen a great deal of domestic disinformation around the pandemic taking place around the world, right? Now, it's happening in every country, in just about every region. And this has contributed to vaccine hesitancy and prolonged the pandemic. I guess, Dalia, I mean, you study these issues very closely. To what extent is the disinformation domestically fueled by foreign actors, in which case, and to what extent is this sort of the foreign actors just taking advantage of a fertile ground for this type of dangerous information and narratives?
It's just a straightforward answer is that definitely there's a homemade disinformation, and there's disinformation that is instigated by the third parties from outside. And as usually in disinformation, it sometimes is difficult even to identify the direct source, but because it works like in throwing a stone into the water, and you have the ripples, circles going out, and then just the point is that to match, to get into the very sensitive issue. And then you have this augmentation, this growth of disinformation. It's talking about COVID pandemic. It's a very, I wouldn't say that something new was introduced in the disinformation field. It's just the packaging. The same narratives, only the topics changed, or it was tossed in a different, shuffled in different sets. But the principle remains the same. And the goals of those who organize disinformation is also very similar, very consistent. We talk in these really very good reports that we are discussing today. We are talking about the soft power of Russia and soft power of China. The goals are very. Their disinformation exercise matches the pattern of the way they exercise the soft power. In this case, unfortunately, malign soft power, that is disinformation. If Russia does not care about its image, even Sputnik vaccine that could have served as proving that it is a high-tech country, with a huge potential, scientific potential, it was messed up again because it was used, these persuasive measures, mechanisms were used to attack and to disrupt the Western audiences, as well as my part, the eastern flank of the European Union or NATO. While China's communication and disinformation was based on promoting, building up its image. It's reminded the tactics again used in Soviet times, in Brezhnev times. That is somewhere in 70s or 80s, perhaps, of the Soviet Union, when every introduction started with "Спасибо, лично спасибо коммунистической партии." So thank you for the Communist Party and personally to Brezhnev for this and that. So this is the same pattern, very similar now, is exercised in China. So having said that, it's a mixture. Again, it's a mixture. There are agents that we know, they are locals, they are Lithuanians or Estonians or Polish, but they are serving the same purpose. They are engaged. Some are proxies, some are agents, some are just, as we know, useful idiots, but that's a mixture of the entire package that provides the source for circulating all kind of mis and malign information in our space.
Excellent. That's very insightful. So Ben, I want to ask you about the report a bit, because one of the things I really love about this report is that it takes on a lot of the conventional wisdom and a lot of the assumptions that we've had about the information space. And so, specifically it dispels some of the myths that are out there, in particular about the learning that exists between Russia and China. For example, you found that Russia is learning from China, not just China from Russia, that China does borrow some elements of Russia's strategy, but only limited amounts. And this is a bit counterintuitive in many ways. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the learning between the two powers and what you found in the data.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the big findings was the real limited amount of formal cooperation between China and Russia. So we only found maybe one or two instances of, say, Sputnik republishing something from People's Daily, or China Daily republishing a work from RT. By and large, these two countries have not only very different goals, but very different media environments, which express themselves in their international propaganda. So whereas Russia is kind of more free form and really lets there be, hundreds of competing conspiracies and narratives, so long as none of them really challenge Russia, within China, they're all very top down. This has helped to make Russia much better adapted to the information environment, where conspiracism and outrage and alarmist titles receive just far more attention than the kind of staid, traditional Communist Party type narratives that you see coming out of the CCP. The goals too are very different. Russia is much less focused on anything constructive. So within Eastern Europe, there was some promotion of Sputnik 5 as this great scientific accomplishment. But within the English-speaking world, where there was never really going to be any chance of people clamoring for Sputnik 5 vaccines, the focus was really much more on just tearing down trust in American and British institutions. And to accomplish this, not only were those institutions not performing at their best over the past year, giving very fertile ground, but they were able to really amplify a lot of American and British voices who, out of their own political interest or out of their sincere belief, also shared those views and were eager to really grab onto anything that was promoting that. China dabbled in this a little bit, but still, by and large, their staff, the journalists that they have, are still very close to the CCP and still struggle a lot to get out of the type of propaganda that might have success within mainland China, where there's a total monopoly on the information environment, but really struggle in a highly competitive environment like the English-speaking online environment. We did see overlap in less overt activity. So one of China's more popular narratives was claiming that COVID actually originated in Fort Detrick. This conspiracy was ultimately popularized by the Center for Research on Globalization, which is a China-linked think tank based out of Canada. They also spread the conspiracy that the Skripal poisoning was actually based off of escaped norovirus from some immunology lab in the UK. But this group, the Center for Research on Globalization, which has strong Russia links, was the ultimate origin that China would link to when trying to deflect blame from the research around the Wuhan immunology lab and to try to deflect that towards the United States.
Yeah, it's amazing to watch the narratives change over time as the sort of geopolitical dynamics change, as the information, as the actual facts on the ground change with the developments and discoveries. And so one of the great parts about the report that you wrote, it has a series of infographics that actually track the narratives. You can see it changing over time, which is really great. It's just a valuable tool. Olga, I want to ask you a question about your report too, because one of the things that I thought was really interesting is that during the pandemic there was this rush from every country and every pharmaceutical company to develop a vaccine, and then what we've seen since then has really been that it's been a much more very nationalistic approach, right? It's been one of the problems that we've seen is that countries have really kind of hoarded the vaccine supplies for their own population, and this is part of the conversation around the development of Omicron and the lack of vaccination among many countries in the world. But what you outline in the report is that Russia was actually very much focused on sharing the vaccine internationally. It was not a domestic focused effort, and you found that there was the primary tool was the international tool. And so I was curious if you just tell us a little bit more about how that fits into Russia's broader strategy and what that means and what that says about the country's goals in the world.
Sure. Yes, what we found was really surprising that Russia was really trying to push its vaccine onto international markets, and within the media that we surveyed, that narrative and that information that they're really trying to push it out started about February 2021 when Russian domestic vaccination, mass vaccination also started. So we could actually contrast the two developments. There is one thing that is important to understand why Russia is doing this. So the organization which has funded the Sputnik V development and also is in charge of international promotion, and its head is the key speaker on the vaccine everywhere, both inside Russia and outside Russia. So the organization is a Russian Direct Investment Fund, which is basically a state subsidized fund and apparently directly controlled by the Kremlin. And its head is Kirill Dmitriev, who is a close friend of Putin's, one of Putin's daughters. So he's an ultimate insider. And we could see some signs that, some rumors on Telegram as well, that he might be, a potential candidate for a top government position coming, in the coming months or years. So he's maybe one of the people that the regime is grooming, who is really close to Putin. So, which is why he has been endowed with this initiative to use Sputnik V as a tool of increasing Russian geopolitical influence, because this is also a practice known from the Soviet times when the Soviet leaders would offer humanitarian aid to developing countries or third world countries, and that would be so-called peaceful infiltration, when you come with a I think Sipa also reported on the Trojan horses, right? So that this is something that you come with a gift to a country, and then you're there to stay and use this sort of as a way in to stay in the country, to exert political influence, and use this country as a, you know, a potential market, a potential political tool, and as a potential ally in your sort of growing zone of influence. So that was one big development. And the second one, of course, is money, because, you know, the Putin regime is known to be kleptocratic. And me living in Russia also, I know a lot of things politically are done actually for the money purposes. However, we saw some limited success here, because as opposed to what the press releases by RDIF claim, you know, incredible success, Sputnik V has been by now approved by 73 countries. And I really like the way they try to use marketing tricks. For example, when they achieved the 70th country to approve Sputnik V, they released this press release saying that now 4 billion people in the world have access to Sputnik V, which sounds really impressive. However, when you actually look at the numbers of the doses, how many doses Sputnik V Russia was able to sell to the rest of the world, it's about 200 to 300 million doses. So it's clearly not 4 billion as they claim. So things like that, I mean, they really jump at us when we read the media. But to contrast it with what happened at the domestic front, that was really a disaster, and especially in the first 3-4 months since the mass vaccination campaign started. And what we saw was not really a propaganda effort. It was really a lack of effort. There were many sort of upbeat claims by the key government officials. For example, one of them claimed that Russia will have a 60% vaccination level by September, and everything is in place. Basically, you know, everything is so positive. We are ahead of the entire planet. But it became clear by June that I think at the time the vaccination level was about lower than 20%, that they will never be able to deliver by September. And by September, it was less than 30%. But when you ask why that happened, why they failed, well, you can quote production failures, which was an objective factor. However, the original failure was in the government coordination and messaging. It was really lazy, and no one really owned the problem. And what happened is, when you report that you have, you know, through propaganda channels, that you have, you know, people lining up to take a vaccine, that vaccine is available in most of the Russian regions, and then you read in newspapers that actually vaccine is not available in more than 2/3 of Russian regions. Russian regions are struggling to actually get access to it. No one understands where, how, and when they will get it. And it's been such a mess in terms of executive power and in terms of information power. So when you sort of weigh it against the entire international marketing drive and the amount of value and premium placed on that, you sort of start questioning what this regime's priorities are, and that becomes pretty clear. Not the population, but, you know, geopolitical influence and money.
Right. Excellent points. So we are approaching time, but there's an important point I want to get everybody's thoughts on. So what I'm thinking is, I'll tee this up, and then this could be a sort of something that everyone can respond to, as similar to how we did the opening remarks. So I'll turn to you, Vera, first. But you know, one of the things that I think came through in both of these reports and both the research is, you know, is that very often in the information operations space, there's a big focus on disinformation as the tool that everyone focuses on. Ben, in your report, you make the point that actually, in this case, propaganda was really one of the more powerful tools that was used. I mean, obviously, disinformation is serious and it's out there and it's real. But one of the things that came through was that the narratives, especially from China, but overall too, that it was closer to propaganda necessarily than traditional disinformation. And similarly, Vera, Olga, in your report, it really outlines how these sort of the public diplomacy aspects of it that can kind of creep into the sort of malign space is also part of the information operations space. And I think that the term you use in the report is over for the way that the Kremlin approaches this is through a discursive Cold War, right? Where it's that Russia's geopolitical influence is influence. It's manifested through information space rather than the Cold War competition of nuclear weapons and ideological rivalries. And so, I guess the question for the panel that we want to close out on is, are we thinking about the information space correctly? Is the West thinking and approaching our handling of the information space in the right way, where are we focused on the right things, and is there anything better that we can and should be doing in that? So I'll turn to Vera first.
Thank you. So indeed, this is something that comes out in our report. It comes out in separate reports as well, is that this kind of what we call information war, what the Russians call Informaционная война, there are many tools in that basket, yes, and disinformation is just one tool. It's a very specific one, it's a very narrow one, and in many cases it is also used sort of mixed with other tools, yes. I mean, it's intermixed with other tools. From our analysis, we saw, for instance, when Kirill Dmitriev, when he first introduces Sputnik V, yes, which is what we call the original sin, yeah. So, and I just want to correct here one point in our report. We do point out that Sputnik V was registered after the end of the second phase trials, but they didn't finish the third phase trials, which is an important point. And it is an original sin because it's such an important, the third phase trials are an important part of kind of scientific ethics. Yes, you have to try whatever you're doing on a large amount of people. You can't just do it on a couple of your friends, 100 of your friends in the Russian elite and say, well, look, they have antibodies, so it works. Yes, so this is not how things are done. What we're seeing here, yes, that for instance, when Dmitriev is introducing it, he's weaving sort of disinformation. He alludes to sort of the fact that mRNA can cause infertility, So he does use disinformation, but this is not the main point. His point is not to disinform Russians or Westerners about the vaccine. His point is that he's taking now something that a Russian scientific institute developed, and he's going to use that for a variety of political goals, one of which serves the Kremlin and their political, sort of geopolitical goals, is to say Russia is first. Russia registered first, the first COVID vaccine, yes, and this is sort of the important message. And everyone who is going to criticize us are Russophobes, engage in information war against us, which is something, again, that we checked in our report, and we didn't find any sort of particularly negative coverage of the Russian vaccine. And domestically as well, this kind of feeds into larger narratives and larger things that the Russian government is doing. And one of those things is that it continuously kind of undermines people by undermining people's trust. It creates kind of a chameleon sort of a Kremlin, where nothing, sort of no blame can ever stick to either anyone in the Kremlin or specifically to President Putin. And in this complex kind of, in this complex situation that the Russians are managing, and that they're inserting something like an anti-COVID vaccine, which is in itself a kind of a very difficult thing for people to handle. Yes, the vaccine that is so new will be injected to so many people. when they insert this kind of thing into an already complex political situation, really what they're doing is that what they did to the, and I think that this is really tragic. Yes, I think that what happened with Sputnik V is tragic. I think it's tragic for the Russians, is that they had a way out. They had a way out. They had a way to save people, and for their own kind of within their own, and we call it the Kremlin complex. Yes, this kind of narcissistic grandeur thinking that we have to be first, we have to sort of register first, we have to do everything best, and if anyone criticizes us, they're out to get us. So for that thing, they just really they will be dealing with the consequences of this decision for many years to come, because they are going to be in a real demographic crisis.
Thank you, Vera. Ben, I'm going to turn to you next. So again, the question is, are we thinking about the information space appropriately? And is it more complex than is often understood?
We absolutely are not thinking about it in the right way. We tend to focus on very kind of minute examples of specific pieces of disinformation, specific narratives that we need to stamp out, that we need to basically censor and make sure that they never see the light of day. But bad ideas have always been out there, and by and large, they always outnumber good ideas and truthful ideas. What's important is actually creating a system where you put a whole bunch of ideas in and the good ones come out from the other side. We absolutely do not have that right now. You know, in the Facebook files that the Wall Street Journal released earlier this year, we learned that when scoring what sort of content is going to show up in your newsfeed, Facebook gave 5 times as much weight to when people respond with anger as to when they actually like a comment. So an information environment that is always going to privilege outrage inevitably is going to privilege the sort of content that delves into conspiracies, that plays on people's inherent biases, that really plays on all of the attributes that the scientific revolution over the past 3 centuries has tried to peel away. So focusing on these really specific narratives, I think, makes us miss the larger point, and especially when social media companies are willing to give a little bit and actually try to douse specific narratives without addressing the fundamental problems of why those narratives are the ones that spread. And it's seen as sort of a political favor, as well as kind of a greater alliance between mainstream media sources, corporations, government, and tech. You wind up heading in a direction where disinformation really can prosper at a level never seen before. When we look at authoritarian states, we have unitary control over all these different levers of power of which way information flows. And if we think that we can replicate that there to just get rid of specific narratives that we don't like, then we are really opening the door for a far worse disinformation future than the one we even have now.
On that note, let's turn to Olga. Olga, you're up next, and then Dalia, you can close us out. This has been a very insightful conversation so far, so I really thank all the participants. Olga, you're up next.
Sure. I agree with Ben in terms that we in the West don't think about the current information war or information event space, and we don't see the big picture. I just want to make a few points. One is that there is a large asymmetry between authoritarian regimes and in the way, like Ben said, they treat information, and the Western democracies. So if it's a shared space and one type of actors basically allow themselves to do whatever they want, they sort of follow a different set of rules. And then you have a different group of countries, Western countries, that have a common set of values, a common set of rules, and sort of try to navigate that space. And in that sense, they're much more constricted as opposed to authoritarian regimes. So that's one problem that is not being addressed properly. The second problem is, of course, the social media companies. They are a major problem of the public space. They created the global environment of information. However, these are the countries that are American companies, and the United States should own this problem and should deal with this problem. So we should understand much better how these companies operate, how the old algorithms work. I mean, the Facebook files showed us that the priorities of these companies. I mean, there are many issues related to how information flows through the structures created by these companies, and we don't know how it works. And there are malign actors who are trying to exploit the loopholes and the vulnerabilities of these platforms, and that's another major problem for the information space. And since you mentioned that we call this the current struggle or competition or war between Russia and the West, discursive Cold War, this is a sort of a smaller problem, but I think it's also important. Language is how we express thought, and sometimes it also influences back the way we think about things. So when the Russian government and the Kremlin officials try to impose the Cold War language onto us through their information efforts, they make us, they try to force us to think within the within the terms of the Cold War that are no longer that applicable. And I think the West should sort of step back, zoom out of this narrative of the Cold War, and come up with its own agenda, with its own sort of understanding of what it is that we are in with, what kind of relationship that is with Russia. It's definitely a competition, but it's not really a Cold War competition. So if we drop the Cold War language, I think Russia will have to sort of level with the West in this situation.
Excellent, thank you, Dalia, for the last word.
Okay. One point, COVID. Unfortunately, the pandemic also gave us an opportunity. The world, regimes, whatever, who is in power, whatever regime is running the country, really to cooperate, because it's pandemic, it's global, it's like climate change. These are the global issues. And here again, we failed. Even when we talk with the Sputnik vaccine or other vaccines, it was a deeper confrontation because, as my colleagues already mentioned, because of different motives. But rather than really using this as a sign, this chance as a sign for constructive cooperation, just overstepping, because that concerns everyone. So this is where again you still see that there's a confrontation of regimes and administration of countries. Now, having said that, and me staying in a disinformation sector or studying the subject for quite a while, I think it's time also to switch, not only describing the problem, the issue, because really it's important, but also to think about what to do with it. And as I come to the words resilience. And resilience, it can be national resilience, society resilience. It's multidisciplinary, multi-methodological subject, as well as disinformation. So it can be national societal resilience. It can be at the European Union or transatlantic level resilience building. And that consists of three parts, very simple. Situation awareness, this is where we are good all the West is very good at analysis and naming really the problem and analyzing, it's important, as well as debunking. That is, we have mechanism, we even think about having quite good structures for preventing this malign information. Another issue that we're not so good, but we are on that path, is media, and media including mainstream media, First of all, journalism, professional journalism, independent news media, transparency, accountability, and support to freedom of media, rule of law, as well as social media. And more looking at into it as platforms, as a model of business, rather than really carrying out this function of media to inform the public about the events. So this is media, and then the third point is education, societal education, media literacy, yes, but at the same time creating demand for critical thinking, for educating, that is telling your own narrative, rather than really being too much focused on the malign agents. It's important, but as I said, it's more important to be strong in our own narratives, as at the national level, as an international. And my only wish is that the like-minded really would be excellent if our threat perceptions and situation evaluation would be more or less on the same level. Because, as I said, in the European Union, we don't have the similar threat perception assessment. So the last wish, resilience building, and focusing on societal resilience building, on assessment of perceptions. And I think at that time, this Cold War pattern of confrontation of regimes and using the one or another language could really somehow disappear, or will ease. There will be less confrontation.
Well, thank you for all of that. This has been a fantastic conversation. I know I've learned a bunch. I hope audience has as well. One thing I just like to emphasize is that I would really just applaud all the authors for the research done here. These are both incredibly important reports, and I learned a lot both reading through both of them. And so I would just really it's always nice when we have real data we can apply to the conversations to help us understand what's happening on the ground. And so I would applaud the authors for this fine work. And I'd also encourage our audience to check it out on the appropriate websites, cepa.org for the SIPA website, and iamrussia.org for the Institute of Modern Russia website. And so there's more materials there as well, in addition to these reports. So I would encourage everyone to look. I would like to thank our panelists, Dalia, Ben, Vera, Olga. This was fantastic. Thank you so much. And I'd like to thank the Institute of Modern Russia for co-hosting this event with SIPA, and really just enjoyed this conversation. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day or evening, depending on where you are in the world.